you guys, it's 4.6, Planning the Guided Literary Analysis. And we're talking about every day as a wide field, every page. Lesson objective students will be able to find patterns that inform meaning by color marking the poem. So I'm excited to introduce to you this technique of poetry analysis. I was first introduced to it by a phenomenal teacher named Caroline O'Neill in the great city of New York City. And it was my first time in New York City. I went for an IB training as kind of a young teacher, and I was mesmerized with the city and all the good info that I got from the training. And so it's kind of a fun memory for me that always comes up when I color mark. Color marking to look for patterns, okay? Patterns shape meaning when we analyze literature through a formalist lens. So take a look at your packet, 4.6, and take a look at the color marking in there. We're taking a look at every day as a wide field, every page. And there are a lot of different ways to go about color marking. So on the document, and I'll show you here too, if I can figure out how to get to my next page, we will take a look at the different ways or different items that you can look for as you're color marking. The directions are to use at least 3 different colors, and after reading the poem a couple of times, trace specific things in the text that jump out at you as being unique or unusual. Then label each of the 3 patterns that you've traced, and finally make a literal statement about each of the 3 or more patterns. And a literal statement, remember, is something that is not debatable. Nobody could argue with you on it. It is there on the page. And then also make an interpretive statement. That's one in which you investigate a meaning beyond the literal. All right, so things that O'Neill suggests we should look for are parts of speech. I always look for the active verbs. That's how I start analyzing poetry, and that works really well for me. You are going to come to your own kind of, tools that work best for you, but that's something I always do, because sometimes it's tricky to just understand what is doing the acting, who is responsible for this verb, what is the subject, and I start by looking at the verbs to determine what or who the subject is. Alternate word meanings, definitions, unusual foreign words, regular words used in irregular ways. What does this sound? This is diction, right? But sometimes you'll notice right away that there's a certain kind of word that's used more than once. Trace it, and then you'll see if that's something that is shaping meaning in the poem or not. Sensory images, phrases, objects, sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. In this poem, I noticed that there are a lot of references to things that are being seen, and then later things that are being voiced or heard. And so that's a pattern that I'm going to show you in a sec. Words of shape or color or texture, are those repeated? I thought maybe color would be repeated in this poem when I saw green, and then I didn't find any other colors, so I gave that one up. Time or space words. This one works really well. This worked well for us in the poem October by Robert Frost, and it might take you places in this poem too. I didn't end up tackling that one, but that might be interesting. Numbers. Are there a lot of numbers used in the poem? You could trace those. Specific references to people or animals. Key sounds, alliteration, assonance, consonants, onomatopoeia. I don't think I defined consonants for you yet. Consonants is the repetition of consonant sounds anywhere in the word. Alliteration, remember, is all about the beginning of a word. So it has to be the same sound repeated at the beginning of a word. Assonance, vowel sounds repeating. Onomatopoeia, the word sounds like what it means. How about rhyme? How about meter? Allusions, historical or mythological references. objects that can function as symbols, like mirrors, landscapes, foods, metals, technology. There's some of those going on in our poem. Religious references, some of those maybe. Weather references. How about seasons? We saw a lot of that in Frost's poems. Repetition is huge, or doubles, or parallels, symmetry. Those are good things to look for. Oppositional pairs, where we have one thing next to another that's opposite. Specific letters repeated. Marks of punctuation, shifts in punctuation, unusual uses of punctuation. Register of speaking. Are there a lot of formal words being used or informal words being used? You could trace those. Or any other recurring item that you notice. Well, let me show you what I came up with when I started looking at this poem, and I think these might get you somewhere. You could potentially trace all of the active verbs. That is my favorite thing to trace, and that is what I always start with when I trace any poem, anything in a poem. I start with the verbs, and I think I have a screen that shows you what they are in a sec, so I'm not going to do that. Also, I thought with the word hope repeated so many times, I thought maybe we could trace emotions, although I don't know if there are a lot of other explicit references to emotion besides hope. Technology, references to technology, references to the natural world. Pronouns, we did that together in class. Questions, exclamation marks and other punctuation, comparative imagery. Those are all some possibilities of things you could trace. Why don't you grab 3 colors? Do you have some markers, highlighters, color pencils? Find them right now. Pick 3 things to trace. You could trace any of these, or you could trace any of these, or anything else that you want to trace. Read the poem and just simply mark them every time you see them. All right, take a break and do that right now. What did you find? Here are some things maybe that you found. For the active verbs, I've traced those. And when I'm saying active, I mean the verbs that are really doing the working in the sentence. There might be other verb-like words. For example, winking is, that's a verb too, but it's not the active verb in the subject. The active verb is we cheer to see. Cheer to see. The fireflies are doing the winking, but they are not the subject. So I found standing, staring, gentles, cheer, see, become, grow, look through, swing, kneeling to find, carries, were, to be, scared, shrinks, feel, lifting, is, was, give, sing, befriend, paused, and reshape. And if I want to spend some time looking at those verbs and how they change, what patterns are created, I might notice at the beginning that there seems to be a lot of verbs having to do with seeing things. And in the second part, the verbs are more about being, like were, to be, is, was. We've got some more specific verbs that show a particular action, like scared, shrinks. But shrinks is related to hope, so that's kind of, it's not an action necessarily that we can see. It's a little bit more figurative. Lifting is also what hope is doing. Is, was, more to be verbs. Give is a specific verb. Sing, befriend, pause, reshape. They get more specific towards the end. Oh, Wolf has joined us for some poetry analysis. He loves poetry. Big fan. Emotions. I didn't get anywhere with that. I just found hope. Did you guys find anything besides hope for emotions? Maybe you did. You can let me know. Technology references. I've got those here. No technology references in the first part. Natural world, a lot of natural world references in the first part. I didn't find any in the second part. Unless you're going to count deep space, which seems to me more related to technology than the natural world. Pronouns, traced all those. Oh, they're hard to see, or maybe I erased some of them. But we've got our, we, our. They're all plural in the first part. They start plural in the second, and then they move to you, singular, and then me, and you at the end. Questions, I noticed there's just 2 questions. There's one here, where have our friends been all the long hours? We have a question mark there. In line, what is that, 8? And then we have another one in line 41. What else did we give each other from such distances? And so the sentences, those questions are, you might call them parallel. You might look closely at what's being asked in each question, how they are similar, because they are similar. Exclamation marks and other punctuation. Well, this is interesting because there is only 1 mark of punctuation in the first part. Any marks of punctuation in the second part. Comparative imagery. We have these comparative images where minds are stretching to become their own skies, and we're looking through words like windows and swinging a sentence open like a door. And then there was this interesting comparative imagery too in part 2. Breath of syllables, sing to me from your balcony, please. Befriend me in the deep space. So breath of syllables is what the speaker is asking to sing to her. And I'm just choosing her, because that's my default. You can choose them or he if you want. Him, them, or him. Befriend me in the deep space. So it's breath of syllables that the speaker is referencing, singing to her, or befriending her. All right. Well, the next step, if we go back to the directions for making, or for color marking, the next step is we are supposed to label the pattern. I guess we've labeled them already, haven't we? And then we make a literal statement about each of the 3 and an interpretive statement about each of the 3. Well, as I was working, I thought, what's interesting about some of the things I found are how they are kind of working together. And so I decided to get a little more specific, a little more precise with naming the patterns, and then I traced them again. So here's what I did. I said, now that I've looked at those kind of basic things, I want to get a little bit more precise so that my analysis is going to really add up to something interesting and profound. So I said, you know what? References to hearing and speaking is a little more interesting than just all the active verbs. And I also noticed that there are references to seeing and eyes, and that's a little more interesting than just all of the verbs. So I thought, references to support is kind of interesting to me, because in the first part, it's physical, and in the second part, it's a little more emotional and figurative. This sounds very physical, lifting you up, but it's a feeling of hope that's lifting you up emotionally. And the sturdy green, I don't know, that's, I guess, fairly figurative as well. Carrying us is probably more emotional than physical as well, but at any rate, I thought those references to support were interesting, that we had multiple references. Befriending me felt supportive, and reshaping the day felt supportive. And since it's in the very end of the poem, I thought, that might be worth looking at. Okay, so I need to make some literal and interpretive claims now. For my first pattern, references to hearing and speaking, here's what I came up with. My literal claim is there are more references to hearing and speaking in part 2 of the poem than in part 1 of the poem. To support that, I would then go on to say in line 4 is the first reference to hearing and speaking, and the speaker says, "We cheer." And that is a reference to a type of speaking. They are speaking loudly in a celebratory way as they cheer to see fireflies. Whereas in part 2, we have countless friends to listen to, and then breath of syllables sing to me. So we have 3 references to hearing and speaking in the second part. My interpretive statement is the increase in references to hearing and speaking in part 2 emphasizes communication and the importance of voices, both using them and listening to them. So in this one, we're listening. In this one, it's breath of syllables. It's a kind of communication, and sing is also a kind of communication. And I thought, you know what, this goes to the guiding question about the theme of communication. And so if I can make an interpretive statement that includes something from the guiding question, then that is going to be really helpful in making sense of the poem. So that one I'm pretty happy with. And then I moved to my next one, which is references to seeing and eyes. And I've got staring eyes, see, winking, look through. This one is kind of interesting because at first I didn't think it was seeing, and then when I looked more closely, I saw kneeling outside to find sturdy green. Well, if we're going to find green, how are we doing that? Typically, we're doing that with our eyes. We see colors. Reading involves the eyes. Exchanging winks is seeing, and blinking is seeing. And then I spent some time working on a literal statement and an interpretive statement, and I got kind of stuck. And when you get stuck, what you have to do is look carefully at what the poem is saying and remind yourself that it's the poem that gives us meaning, and that we have to go back to the text in the poem and let it mean how it means, instead of trying to force a meaning onto it, okay? And so what I noticed was that in part 1, the speaker explicitly references 4 separate instances of looking at objects, while in part 2, there's just one reference to looking at objects. Now, if you look at my color marking, I have 4 words highlighted, so that looks like 4. But when I looked at things a little more closely, I noticed, first of all, read. If I'm looking at the differences between part 1 and part 2, which is what the guiding question asks me to do regarding communication, reading, although it involves eyes and seeing, it really has more to do with communication than looking or seeing. Whereas in part 1, we're staring at a tree. We see fireflies winking. We're looking through. We're finding a color. These are things that are a little more basic. Reading has to do with, seeing what someone else has written down and understanding a point that they are making. So I thought, maybe that actually fits more with communication than sight. And so I kind of looked at that contrast between the two parts. And exchanging winks in the dark, little lights blinking, this is really just one thing that they're looking at, right? It's literally looking at the phone or technology implement, hardware, and seeing lights blinking when there's some kind of communication. So my interpretive statement reads, there is a movement from focusing on seeing to communicating with others in the poem, creating a more connected feeling between people. What do you think? Like that one? All right. Then I moved on to my third one about support, references to support. Here's what I came up with for this one. In part 1, the speaker calls green sturdy and notes that it carries us, while in part 2, The hope of someone far away lifts you up and is given to each other. So I'm in part one, I'm really just showing how these references to support function in kind of a literal way. I'm looking at the structure of the sentence and saying, okay, the speaker calls green sturdy, and that is a support. The idea of something being sturdy means that it can hold or support, it's strong. And I could go on and explain that in my paragraph. And then in part two, the support is through other people and hope. And so, again, I would explain this going step by step, how it functions in a literal way. You know, focusing on what's interesting about it, but not making any interpretive claims at first. And then, again, this took me a long time to get here. I sat down and I tried writing this out a few different times, and I eventually came up with the change from nature to other people as support suggests that there is hope for humans to take care of each other through communication. Once again, I've made sure that I'm using the guiding question to help me in getting to some kind of point about communication. I'm looking at the contrast between the two parts. And I am going back to the literal, the non-debatable. So I'm pretty happy with this. I think I could write some interesting stuff about this. And maybe these would be my main 3 body paragraphs now that I would write about. Or if you felt like you did your best work with your understanding poetry questions instead of color marking, maybe you're going to go back to that. Maybe you're going to use your understanding poetry questions to come up with your color marking stuff now, which is really what I did. Whichever way you go about doing it, good luck as you work on this. And I've suggested in your packet that you actually have 4 patterns. And I guess this is more than a suggestion, it's a must-do. So I've got 3 for you here. You can take from my stuff if it makes sense to you, okay? But then you have to find at least 1 more on your own. So you need 4 patterns. You need to trace 4 patterns now. And you need to have a literal statement and an interpretive claim for each pattern. All right? Thanks. That's all I've got for you.